Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Campaign of Giants, The Battle for Petersburg, Volume 1, From the Crossing of the James to the Crater, by A. Wilson Greene. Foreword by Gary W. Gallagher. Narrated by Paul Woodson. Foreword. The Petersburg Campaign extended from the early summer of 1864 into the spring of 1865. By far the longest and most complex military operation of the Civil War, it featured each side's most famous and accomplished general, produced scores of thousands of casualties, closed with the premier Confederate army in full retreat and the rebel capital under Union control, and set up the climactic surrender at Appomattox just a week later. Most often treated as an example of two armies locked in a grinding siege, some authors argue that it anticipated the stalemate on the Western Front in World War I. The campaign, in fact, featured complex maneuvering and a number of individual battles, as well as the creation of the most sophisticated systems of fieldworks and fortifications to that point in United States history. Among all major operations of the Civil War, only Petersburg has lacked a modern, comprehensive scholarly study. Indeed, campaigns such as Antietam, Vicksburg, Shiloh, Chickamauga, Atlanta, and Chancellorsville continue to inspire numerous expansive treatments. Never mind Gettysburg, which has spawned a literature of several thousand items that offers detailed discussions of almost every phase of the fighting and every officer of any significance. Why has Petersburg remained relatively understudied? The obvious answer, and almost certainly the correct one, is that scholars have been intimidated by the daunting prospect of doing justice to an event that extended across nearly 300 days, involved 4 armies, and included ancillary cavalry operations that ranged far from the besieged city. Various historians have examined parts of the overall story, but none has undertaken a full operational treatment. The existing titles, which include a number of very fine ones, thus help readers understand pieces of the campaign, but collectively do not convey a clear picture of the whole. Many general histories of the Civil War avoid any serious discussion of Petersburg altogether, leaving readers with a nebulous sense of military stasis between the forces of Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, while operations overseen by William Tecumseh Sherman, Philip H. Sheridan, and other Union generals played out in Georgia, Tennessee, the Shenandoah Valley, and the Carolinas between July 1864 and March 1865. A. Wilson Greene's impressive analytical narrative, A Campaign of Giants, will fill this glaring gap in the military literature on the Civil War. This volume, the first of 3 projected in the study, takes readers through the end of July 1864, when the Union failure at the Battle of the Crater foreclosed the possibility of a quick end to the drama at Petersburg. Greene's mastery of the subject is abundantly evident, as is his ability, in the course of describing maneuvering and combat, to analyze commanders, engage long-held interpretive conventions, and bring into the picture experiences of both common soldiers and civilians in Petersburg. Greene's text, based on a thorough canvass of primary sources and an admirable command of secondary works, serves as a model of informed, even-handed analysis of numerous topics that have prompted lively disagreement in the literature. Was Lee fooled by Grant's movement across the James River during the second week of June? Who was responsible for the failed Union assaults against very badly outnumbered Confederates on June 15th? How did Benjamin F. Butler retain command of the Army of the James, despite obvious shortcomings? Did the decision not to use African-American units in the first wave of attackers at the crater make a difference? Greene's arguments may not persuade all readers, but they are so well crafted and based on such immersion in the sources that they demand serious consideration. In addition to the quality of his research and analysis, Greene writes in a fashion acceptable to both scholars and non-specialists. This element of his work fits especially well with the Civil War America series' goal of bringing fine scholarship to the broadest possible audience. Greene joins a distinguished group of historians, among them Harry W. Fonts, Robert K. Crick, Earl J. Hess, and Peter Cousins, who have contributed operational and tactical studies to the series. This volume, and the two that follow, will invite contemplation not only of the soldiers and officers who confronted one another at Petersburg, but also, by extension, of the two societies that sent them into action and dealt with the uncertainty and cost of protracted military conflict. Gary W. Gallagher. Preface. I spent 25 years working and living on Petersburg's battlefields, first with the National Park Service and then as the executive director of Pamplin Historical Park, scene of the campaign's climactic attack. During that quarter-century I learned that even the most dedicated students of the American Civil War had an imperfect understanding of those 292 days, during which the war's best-known armies grappled over possession of Virginia's second-largest city. I frequently encouraged my professional colleagues to undertake a comprehensive study of the Petersburg story. They all agreed that such an endeavor was needed, but no one agreed to tackle the job. I watched approvingly as Noah André Trudeau, The Last Citadel, and Earl J. Hess, In the Trenches at Petersburg, produced excellent one-volume overviews of the campaign. Professionally executed monographs by Thomas J. Howe, Hess, John Horne, Hampton Newsome, and John J. Fox III joined Richard Summers's magisterial Richmond Redeemed in addressing individual aspects of the campaign. I tried to contribute to that effort with books on the campaign's final week and a study of wartime Petersburg. Yet the field still lacked an operational history of the military events between June 1864 and April 1865 that all but sealed the fate of the Confederacy. This volume, the first of 3, is the down payment on filling that void. I'm under no illusion that my work is definitive. Such an undertaking would require many more than 3 volumes. 4 armies fought around Petersburg for more than 9 months. The campaign spanned both sides of the James and Appomattox rivers and included cavalry raids that strayed miles from the cockade city. Conventional wisdom tallies some 70,000 casualties in the battles for Petersburg, not to mention the impact, fatal and otherwise, on the 18,000 residents of the Confederacy's 7th-largest metropolis. Military engineering reached its Civil War zenith around Petersburg, soldiers on both sides endured unprecedented living conditions, and the United States conducted an election campaign that levied an enormous impact on the conduct of military operations. A campaign of giants attempts to strike a balance between providing enough tactical detail to satisfy demanding consumers of military history, while never losing sight of the campaign's overall context. The perspective of the common soldier finds voice in these pages, even as I address and analyze command decisions at the Army's highest echelons. The first 6 weeks of the Petersburg Campaign feature a number of controversies that have intrigued scholars and readers for generations. Issues such as Robert E. Lee's measured response to the Union Army's crossing of the James River, the failure of the Federals to exploit their success on June 15, 1864, the futility of Grant's first offensive, despite the Federals' overwhelming numerical superiority, and the preparation for and conduct of the Battle of the Crater receive my attention. I've tried to present the evidence surrounding these episodes and others, and render conclusions based on my reading of the sources. I hope and expect that those conclusions will generate further discussion. Because the Union armies maintained the operational initiative around Petersburg in June and July, I spend considerable time dissecting their inner workings. I have attempted to unravel the relationships among the ranking Federal commanders, Grant, George Meade, and Benjamin Butler. Grant held the most important position in this saga, but his performance in many respects proved disappointing. Readers may be as surprised as I was to discover the many shortcomings in Grant's leadership once his troops crossed the James. The Federals undertook 3 distinct offensives between June 15th and July 30th. The first, June 15th through 18th, resulted in the capture of a large portion of the original Confederate defense line, but failed to conquer the city. The second offensive, June 22nd through 24th, proved to be a tactical disaster for the Bluecoats, whose effort to cut the railroads leading into Petersburg from the south and the west fell short. It also included a massive cavalry raid that, despite damaging much of the Confederate transportation network leading into Petersburg, ended in defeat. The third offensive, July 26th through 30th, saw a major initiative north of the James River come to naught, and featured the campaign's most spectacular combat, the infamous Battle of the Crater. In addition to these significant military initiatives, the cavalry engaged in a number of minor actions, particularly east of Richmond, while the armies around Petersburg sparred in lesser-known actions. African-American troops engaged in significant combat for the first time in the Eastern Theater during the first 6 weeks of the Petersburg Campaign. I have focused considerable attention on their performance and the attitudes toward black troops among Confederates, white Federals, and civilians. The experience of Petersburg's residents during the summer of 1864 warrants its own chapter. 1. War at Our Own Doors. Teenaged Anne Bannister watched in dread as a wagon carrying the lifeless body of her father approached her Petersburg, Virginia home. My precious mother stood like one dazed, but in a few seconds she was kneeling by my father in such grief as I had never seen before, she remembered. Throughout the city, similar vehicles brought dead or mangled men to their distraught families and friends. Night closed in, and we sat down face to face with our woe, wrote one Petersburg resident. Some to watch the dying, others to keep vigil beside the dead, while numberless hearts agonized in prayer for loved ones torn from home, and now on their way to pine, and perhaps die, in some northern prison. Bessie Meade Callender, the wife of a local cotton mill manager and part-time militiaman, remembered Friday, June 10th, 1864 as the saddest day that ever dawned on Petersburg. 78 citizens, most of them outside the military age limits, had been killed, wounded, or captured the previous day, including 59-year-old William Bannister, one of 15 Petersburg residents who died. The funerals began that morning in most of the city's churches and some private homes, and continued into the next day. It was a day of mourning for all, recalled Mrs. Callender. The latest in a series of offensives orchestrated by Major General Benjamin F. Butler provided the source of Petersburg's salvation and sadness on June 9th. Nurtured by ambition and operational success in seemingly equal proportion, Butler, the commander of the Union's Army of the James, targeted Petersburg's military resources. He particularly eyed the railroad bridge that spanned the Appomattox River and provided the final link connecting the Confederate capital at Richmond with Virginia's second city, 23 miles to the south. Butler assembled a force of infantry and cavalry numbering roughly 4,600 men, calculating that the advantage of a destructive raid on Petersburg would be cheaply purchased at 500, and not too dearly with the sacrifice of 1,000 men in killed and wounded. Major General Quincy A. Gilmore would lead 2 columns of infantry on parallel paths against Petersburg's eastern defenses, while Brigadier General August V. Kautz directed 1,300 cavalry around to the city's southeastern portal along Jerusalem Plank Road. Butler understood that the Petersburg fortifications were weak and only thinly defended. One of the few first-class Confederate soldiers stationed in Petersburg confirmed that the trenches were so low that a man would have to get down on his knees in them to cover his head. 1,000 men could have eaten us up almost. Gilmore's march started slowly on the morning of June 9th, affording Petersburg's uniformed defenders sufficient warning to summon the militia. The city's fire bells broke out into chorus with so vigorous a peal and a clangor so resonant as to suggest to the uninitiated a general conflagration, wrote attorney and state legislator Anthony Kiley, who well understood the import of the metallic cacophony. The reserve units, buttressed by 500 soldiers of the 46th Virginia, manned the eastern perimeter, so Kiley and about 125 others of the non-conscribable population headed for the Timothy Reeves farm south of town. Here the eroded fortifications, penetrated by Jerusalem Plank Road, offered scant protection to the ersatz warriors. Brigadier General Raleigh Colston, a veteran of the Army of Northern Virginia without current portfolio, assumed local command, while Brigadier General Henry A. Wise, Petersburg's official commanding officer, rushed northward to seek reinforcements. Gillmore's twin columns encountered rifle and cannon fire from the determined, if grossly outnumbered, defenders that halted the tentative Federal advance. The Confederate fortifications formed a projection, or salient, that divided one of Gillmore's columns from contact and cooperation with the other. Reports filtered back to Gillmore's rear echelon headquarters that the position and strength of the enemy would be difficult to conquer, and the Union commander suspended his attack. "As soon as the nature of the works in our front was ascertained," he explained, "I was convinced that an assault upon them would in all probability fail, and I ordered the two positions to be maintained, expecting every moment to hear of General Kautz." His men had suffered 15 casualties out of some 3,300 he brought to the field, a tiny fraction of the human value Butler had placed on destruction of the railroad bridge. A few days later, in noting that Confederate press accounts failed to mention the presence of the Federal infantry, Butler wrote one of Gillmore's subordinates that, "I hope the next town we attack we shall get near enough for the enemy to know we are there." The focus then shifted to the Union cavalry south of the city. Kautz commanded the cavalry division in Butler's army, but on June 9th his 2 brigades of 2 regiments each were badly under strength. 2 guns of the 8th New York Independent Light Artillery and a handful of mountain howitzers constituted all of Kautz's ordnance. Butler assumed that Kautz would face only token resistance, and that his breakthrough would be the signal for Gillmore to rush the eastern fortifications. The ride around to the southern outskirts of Petersburg consumed most of the morning, longer than the Union High Command anticipated. By 11:30 a.m., the vanguard of Kautz's force arrived opposite the works, now manned by about 160 citizen militia under Major Fletcher Archer, a Petersburg lawyer who commanded the 3rd Battalion Virginia Reserves. "What a line it was," recalled Archer. "In number scarcely more than sufficient to constitute a single company. In dress, nothing to distinguish them in appearance from citizens pursuing the ordinary avocations of life. In age, many of them with heads silvered o'er with the frosts of advancing years, while others could barely boast of the down upon the cheek. In arms and accoutrements such as an impoverished government could afford them." Archer's militia occupied both sides of Jerusalem Plank Road, stretching more than 1/3 of a mile and facing south. The bulk of the men huddled just west of the highway, which had been blocked by an overturned wagon and crude fence rail barriers. Despite the relative weakness of Kautz's nominal division, it still outnumbered its opponents more than 8-1. Armed primarily with smoothbore muskets, the militia was, in the words of Anthony Kiley, "compelled to watch the preparations for our capture or slaughter, much after the fashion that a rational turtle may be presumed to contemplate the preliminaries of a civic dinner in London." Union Brigade Commander Colonel Samuel Spear impetuously called for a squadron of the 11th Pennsylvania Cavalry to charge the Confederate works. "Everyone saw that this was a party we could easily manage," reported Kiley, "and we possessed, therefore, our souls in great patience, till we could see the chevrons on the arm of the non-commissioned officer who led them." A ragged volley erupted from the rebel line, dropping a handful of bluecoats and sending the rest streaming back to the cover of woods. Kautz soon arrived on the scene, condemning the results of Spear's charge as the fate of his stupidity. He then proceeded to err in the opposite extreme. Couts and Spear reconnoitered, dismounted most of their force, and carefully aligned the troopers so that they overlapped both flanks of Archer's little band. By then a single cannon had arrived to bolster the Confederate defenses, causing Couts to unlimber his own guns and engage in an artillery exchange, further delaying the inevitable. The Federals enjoyed a clear advantage in firepower, but Couts used this interlude to work his troopers gradually around the eastern flank of Archer's line. The time expended, however, had allowed word to reach the Confederate Department Commander, General P.G.T. Beauregard, of the developing crisis in Petersburg. By mid-morning, on Beauregard's authority, the 4th North Carolina Cavalry and Captain Edward Graham's Petersburg Battery, under the overall command of Brigadier General James Deering, began a frantic ride from their camps 7 miles north of the city. Crossing the Appomattox River and careening through the streets of town, Graham shouting, "Damn the women! Run them over if they don't get out of the way!" These welcome reinforcements headed for the heights at the south end of the city. By this time, Couts's overcautious tactics had succeeded in gaining the flank and rear of Archer's weary volunteers. "We fought them till we were so surrounded that the 2 nearest men to me were shot in the back while facing the line of original approach," Kiley lamented. "One by one, my comrades fell around me," he observed, before joining a number of other militia as captives. "The enemy trooped over the earthwork behind me, and the foremost, presenting his loaded carbine, demanded my surrender with an unrepeatable violence of language that suggested bloodshed. All avenue of escape being cut off, I yielded with what grace I could to my fate, captive to the bow and spear of a hatchet-faced member of the 1st District Cavalry, greatly enamored of this honorable opportunity of going to the rear." Archer's losses exceeded 50%, but the 2 hours he stymied the Union cavalry bought Deering and Graham time to deploy behind the city reservoir, on high ground overlooking the Union route of approach. The Yankees dawdled even longer, interrogating prisoners, looting the Confederate camps, and burning the Reeves house. But eventually Couts sent his men northward on Jerusalem Plank Road. When they reached the intersection with New Road, most of the troopers turned northwest toward the reservoir, while others continued due north, aiming for the heights called Wells Hill, on which stood the ruins of Blandford Church. Both columns faced Confederate fire, and Spear mistook the walls of the reservoir for a strong stockade. Presented with additional resistance and hearing nothing from the Union infantry, in fact Gilmore had ordered a retreat by then, Couts considered discretion the better part of valor, and directed his troopers to fall back and return to their camps. Petersburg had been spared. The drama of June 9th merely marked the most recent in a stream of threats that had imperiled Petersburg for 5 weeks. The chief architect of that menace, Benjamin Butler, left a distinct impression on everyone who encountered him. A Massachusetts Democrat of enormous influence, Butler's staunch support of the Union war effort earned him early military prominence. His timely arrival in Annapolis, Maryland, during the war's opening days, his subsequent declaration at Virginia's Fort Monroe that runaway slaves should be considered contraband of war, and his role in 1862 as conqueror of New Orleans, the Confederacy's largest metropolis, kept him in the headlines, a place Butler coveted. Controversy about the ethics of his administration of occupied New Orleans sidelined his military career for nearly a year. But in November 1863, Butler assumed command of the Department of Virginia and North Carolina, something of a backwater assignment with responsibility for the Union-controlled coastal regions of those 2 states. Butler's appearance, as much as his accomplishments, arrested people's attention. Short, fat, shapeless, no neck, squinting, and very bald-headed, was how one Union officer sized him up. Another pronounced the general a queer-looking man, admitting his beauty won't kill him. No one painted a more vivid picture than prisoner of war Anthony Kiley, who was brought to Butler for questioning following the fighting on June 9th. Upon his first glimpse of the Union commander, Kiley felt profound gratitude to God, who creates no mortal enemy to man without clothing it with features that excite the instant and instinctive aversion of the entire human race. To Benjamin F. Butler's face, scarce an element is wanting of absolute repulsiveness. Rapacity finds appropriate expression in his vulture nose, sensuality in his heavy pendant jaws, despotism in his lowering eyebrow, and to these facial charms is added an optical derangement which permits him to scrutinize you with his left eye, the one he seems to place the most dependence on, while the right, revolving in a different plane, wanders away in another field of vision. Add to this a cool complacency of speech and gesture, which assures you he is on best of terms with his portly self, and I fancy you will have a description which will convince you that nature has hung out the sign of villain in every lineament of the brute's physiognomy. By the spring of 1864, Butler controlled a field army nearly 40,000 strong, including infantry corps under Major Generals William F. Baldy Smith and Gilmore, along with Coutz's cavalry. He met with the new Union General-in-Chief, Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, in early April, and received orders to participate in a three-pronged offensive in Virginia. Butler's job would be to steam up the James River from his base at Fort Monroe, land at City Point, the confluence of the Appomattox and James Rivers 8 miles northeast of Petersburg, and on the Bermuda Hundred Peninsula between those two tidal waterways, and cooperate with Grant in operations against the Confederate capital. "Richmond is to be your objective point," Grant explained. "This indicates the necessity of your holding close to the south bank of the James River as you advance." Nowhere in these instructions did Grant mention Petersburg. Butler's fleet left Hampton Roads at the mouth of the James on May 5th, and by late afternoon began disgorging thousands of soldiers less than a day's march from Petersburg. The local Confederate commander, Major General George E. Pickett, had been warning the War Department in Richmond of the potential threat posed by Butler's massive army, but Pickett's penchant for crying wolf had undermined his credibility. Fortunately, his immediate superior, General Beauregard, gave Pickett's pleas some credence. Beauregard promptly began forwarding reinforcements from North Carolina, where he maintained the headquarters of his Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia, which included a district composed of Petersburg and the land north to the James River. Until these troops arrived, Pickett would have only 500 veterans and a few local militiamen to defend both Petersburg and the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad that connected the two cities. Butler's forces began disembarking at 4 p.m. without opposition, but on the advice of his corps commanders, Butler failed to move toward the railroad only several miles to the west. The next afternoon, Butler cautiously advanced westward with a single brigade under Brigadier General Charles Heckman. Heckman encountered newly arrived Confederates near a small rail intersection called Port Walthall Junction, and despite enjoying numerical superiority of more than 4-1, he sustained 68 casualties and called it a day. Butler fumed, blaming General Gilmore for timidity and disobedience of orders, and immediately employed his political connections to thwart Senate confirmation of Gilmore's major generalcy. While the Federal infantry dithered at Bermuda Hundred, General Kautz targeted the Petersburg Railroad, the line that connected Petersburg with Weldon, North Carolina, and ultimately with the critical Confederate port at Wilmington, North Carolina. The Union raiders destroyed 2 important bridges along that line on May 7th and 8th, and then headed for City Point, having successfully compromised Petersburg's southern line of supply and reinforcement. Pickett, his force growing from almost hourly accretions, then sacrificed his northern communications when, on the night of May 7th, despite having turned back another Federal probe near Port Walthall Junction, he withdrew south across Swift Creek, a major tributary of the Appomattox River. The Federals had snipped the telegraph line between Richmond and Petersburg and damaged a small section of the railroad during their May 7th offensive. The overstressed Confederate commander, on the brink of an emotional breakdown, felt that Petersburg now faced peril from the north, south, and east, and sought to consolidate his strength closer to the city. Thanks to the speed with which Beauregard had dispatched his brigades from the Carolinas, and despite Coutz's depredations, Pickett had assembled about 5,000.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?